Hello and welcome. I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Cipher Brief studio. I'm Suzanne Kelly here with our Cipher Brief team. Brad, as you know, runs pretty much everything around this place. Alicia is your go-to contact if your organization is interested in sponsoring any of these briefings. They're incredibly helpful briefings. We get great feedback on them. So we'd love for the private sector to step up today and help support them, much in the way that Cyware has for this briefing. So I really want to extend a very warm thank you and welcome to today's sponsor, Cyware, for making this briefing possible. All right, we're gonna have more on that in a moment, but first, before we get going today, talking about ransomware's impact on the national security supply chain, I have just a few announcements. First, the Cipher Brief is launching a new cyber initiatives group. We're proud to say that our guest today, Dmitri Alperovitch, is a member of that group, as well as a lot of other brilliant leaders in the cybersecurity space, from General Keith Alexander to FireEye's Kevin Mandia, or to FireEye Mandia, so I'm gonna get used to that, Kevin Mandia, to former PDD&I Sue Gordon, which many of you know all of these people. You can sign up to be a part of this group for free. You'll get notified about upcoming cyber summits if you are, and you'll also receive our monthly newsletter all around cyber specifically. So think of it as a new way to think about cyber, as it now impacts every single sector of our world, and you can sign up at cyberinitiativesgroup.com. If you're interested in sponsoring that group as well, we welcome your support. Booz Allen has come in as one of the early primary sponsors to help drive these conversations because they're critically important, so our thanks to them as well. Many of the principals in the Cyber Initiatives group are also going to be joining us for the Cipher Brief Threat Conference, October 24th to 26th in Sea Island, Georgia. Dmitri is going to be there along with NSA's Cybersecurity Director Rob Joyce, CISA Director Jen Easterly. GCHQ's Chief Sir Jeremy Fleming is joining virtually this year from London, mostly because we all know the travel restrictions. And they're joining us to host a private sector. Professionals are going to be there as well. If you are a professional working either in the cyberspace or in the national security space in general, this is a do not miss event. So you can find more at tcbconference.com. All right, enough sales pitchy stuff from me, but I just want to make sure that all of this stuff is on your radar. Let's quickly get some logistics out of the way. Today's briefing is on the record. We have a number of folks joining from the media. We'd like to welcome all of you. Thanks for all your hard work and covering national security issues. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Feel free to quote from today's session. Also, if you'd like to ask a question for anyone, please submit it using the chat box that's in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If that's too complicated, like it is for me, you can always email your questions to Brad at bchristian@thecipherbrief.com. Also, as I mentioned, thanks to Cyware for sponsoring this briefing. I'd really like to take just a moment to highlight what the private sector is doing in this space when it comes to ransomware and understanding the connectivity of the private sector and government. So Tom Stockmeyer served in the US Marine Corps, and he now leads cyber intelligence sharing and the collaboration practice for Cyware. So I'd like to welcome Tom for just a couple of minutes today. Tom, I'm really interested to know what you're seeing when it comes to ransomware from the private sector perspective, particularly as it impacts the national security mission.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you, Suzanne. I think this is going to be it's a great session. You can't go a day almost without hearing about another ransomware attack somewhere. And I think part of the root cause is, over the years, most organizations have primarily focused on how to better protect their own organizations from, cyber and ransomware attacks. But as dependency on supply chains and connectivity of those supply chains has increased, so have the ransomware attacks on those supply chains. And let me just give you one recent example that'll show you like 3 arms lengths of how something rippled through a supply chain dating back to July of this year. And basically, hackers breached a company called Cyware. It's a Florida-based company, and they make IT management tools and software tools that monitor and control computer networks. And they sell those tools to MSPs, managed service providers, who in then turn provide services to hundreds of thousands of small and medium businesses. Well, the hackers put malware or ransomware into breach the Cyware systems And then that spread to 50 of their MSPs,
Mm-hmm.
who in turn spread it to 1,500 of their customers. And then the hackers, basically locked down the data and encrypted it and demanded a $50 million ransom fee in order to get the key to uncrypt the data. And that's just a recent example from a couple of months ago. And we all know that a healthy supply chain is vital to a customer's success, right? And the old adage, you're only as strong as your weakest link.
Mm-hmm.
That was true today as it was hundreds of years ago. And I think the question remains, right? And that's part of why we're on this call, is in an interconnected supply chain world, how do you best protect your entire supply chain, right?
Exactly right.
And if I may, let me just talk about what, some of the things that we see large companies doing.
Mm-hmm.
Over the years, large companies have started vetting vendors and making vendors fill out, vendor questionnaires about their security stack, their processes, and things like that. And you go through a vetting process, right? And some are better than others, but big companies have been asking vendors to do that. And now we're starting to see some of those same big companies contractually require their vendors to report cyber breaches within a certain period of time.
Right.
And that's a good practice, but honestly, it's a little bit like looking in the rearview mirror. Like a vendor reporting, vendor as part of a supply chain reporting that they had a ransomware attack after the fact is not going to really stop the ransomware from spreading to other connected vendors that are part of the supply chain. And it's not going to protect, more importantly, the parent company or the 800-pound gorilla in the supply chain from disruption.
Yeah.
And our view on this, there's not one single answer, but you can really help take two relatively easy steps in your supply chain. One, the bigger players in the supply chain have far more sophisticated, cyber shops than the smaller vendors that participate in the supply chain, right? And so
It's part of the problem.
yeah, that's right. And if the larger vendors can start to proactively share, high fidelity or meaningful threat intelligence throughout their whole supply chain, that's going to be helpful. And if they can also enable collaboration between vendors in the supply chain, right? Because a lot of times in your supply chain, you're not just in one industry. Just, you have suppliers that go cross sector, right? And you need that collaboration. And we think those are a couple of things that we're starting to see in the market.
Excellent. Tom, I really want to thank you for that. It's great to, especially given where your company sits when it comes to this issue, to know what you're seeing and to hear about, starting to understand how you're thinking about addressing these things. And, obviously, I think you're not going to get a whole lot of people arguing with you today about, the fact that we're reporting in the rearview mirror, as you put it, is not going to help. So thank you so much. We appreciate you being a part of this conversation and being part of this. Thanks so much.
Well, let me just wrap up, if you don't mind, a little bit about Cyware. This will only take a second, but we really help organizations build, and you touched on this, build virtual cyber fusion centers that help enable that end-to-end threat intelligence, visibility and sharing process. And it's sort of evidence of that in the past 15 months, 18 of, say, the largest 25 ISACs have converted to our Fusion platform. And member companies of those critical industry ISACs now share intelligence, pretty much 24/7 and instantly collaborate in ways that they just couldn't do this before, right? And in all, there are about 9,000 companies sharing intel across our platforms through their ISACs. And if you think about it, a supply chain is really like an ISAC in a way, right? You could, the risk of a ransomware attack on your supply chain is similar to how ISACs reduce risk for their individual members.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can, leverage some of those same tools and some of those same best practices, and you can really strengthen the weakest links in your supply chain and better protect your whole supply chain from a ransomware attack. And lastly, I'm looking forward to the National Threat Conference in October. We're sponsored. We'll be there in October. Let's collaborate. And if anybody wants to reach out to me directly, I'm tom.stockmeyer@cyware.com. Thank you.
Excellent, Tom. We appreciate that. Thank you. That is a really fantastic venue for a lot of sidebar conversations that happen. We're looking forward to seeing you there. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Well, all right, I'm going to get right to it. Dmitri Alperovitch hardly needs an introduction at all, but he is the executive chairman at Silverado Policy Accelerator. He's the co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStike, the cybersecurity company we're all very familiar with. In 2016, Dmitri revealed Russian intelligence agencies' hacking of the Democratic National Committee, events which unveiled the full scope of cyber influence operations that was being launched against the US election in 2016. And I know we all remember that as well. Dmitri is currently a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center's Defending Digital Democracy Project. He's a Cyber Initiatives Group principal and is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Dmitri, welcome.
Hi, Suzanne. How are you?
I'm good. We're both wearing plaid today. It must be fall.
Well, this is my official thread jacket. So
it's true. It is your signature jacket, and you're wearing it better than I am. But we're not going to talk about that. I just want to welcome you and thank you for being a part of this conversation today on kind of ransomware's impact on the national security supply chain. We've talked at length this year, Dmitri, on a number of these issues. And we were really thinking that 2020 was the year of ransomware, and then 2021 came along. I'm very interested to start off this conversation by having you talk a little bit about how you've seen the threat evolve, and then let's talk kind of how it's impacting the national security supply chain.
Well, thanks again for having me. I'm looking forward to seeing you in Sea Island in just a little over a month now, so that'll be a really nice distraction from Delta and all the COVID issues we're having yet again. But ransomware, heavy topic indeed. First of all, let me give you a little bit of history. Ransomware, of course, is not new. There have been ransomware attacks going back to the late 80s, early 90s, when people realized that, hey, you can encrypt files on a machine, you can demand a ransom to be paid to unlock those files. But for a long time, those attacks weren't very widespread because what they lacked was a payment infrastructure that would allow a criminal to collect that ransom in an anonymous fashion and not be tracked down by law enforcement. So originally, those attacks literally would leave a note saying, here's the bank account, please wire the money there. As you can imagine, that money can be easily traced, easily retrieved through the official banking system. So the business model just did not make a lot of sense, did not work, and most cyber criminals were not engaging in these types of attacks. That all changed after 2009 and the infamous Bitcoin paper from Satoshi and the emergence of cryptocurrency that now allowed these criminals to receive payments to the tune of tens of millions of dollars in some of these cases and have it be essentially pseudo-anonymous. Not untraceable because the one element of the blockchain is that every transaction is actually recorded on the blockchain, but you don't know who the end recipient is. And that allows these criminals to really monetize these attacks to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars. Some really good research from a company called Chain Analysis last year that tracks a lot of the cryptocurrency transactions suggests that there were over 300 million payments, and that's probably just a fraction of what we actually are able to track right now going to these criminal operations. So the problem is getting worse and worse, the money is getting bigger, and anytime you have a business model that is collecting tens of millions of dollars every year, you're going to see a lot of innovation, a lot of rapid evolution in terms of tradecraft techniques, and that's exactly what we've been seeing over the last few years. One of the most innovative things that we had seen from these criminal ecosystems is the emergence of a franchise model. This happened a number of years ago, but the top criminals, sort of the kingpins, if you will, many of them based, unfortunately, in Russia, realized that they can spend their time and effort building the systems, the platforms to deploy ransomware, building the malware, building the infrastructure to collect ransoms, to negotiate payments, make this as easy as possible for the operators that would actually execute those attacks, but stay away from doing those operations themselves. That would give them some level of distance from the actual operators, in their minds, probably with hope that it would make it harder to trace them and ultimately identify them. But it also gives them flexibility to have a pretty cushy job, being essentially software developers, but getting a cut of all these ransom operations that their franchisees would now be executing. And that's exactly what we've been seeing, where you have just a huge swath of actors, really from all over the world, not just Russia, but Western Europe, Turkey, Latin America, many other places, signing up to be affiliates of these ransom crews like DarkSide, that of course hit the Colonial Pipeline back in May, like Evil that hit Kaseya, that Tim just talked about. And these individuals are sort of lone wolves. Some of them have skills, some of them may not. Some of them may even just acquire access into a victim company by buying it from a botnet operator that managed to infect some machines within that company. And now you can go and essentially buy that access, go to the ransom crew to get your malware deployed within the company, and just sit back and wait for the ransom payment to arrive. So that has enabled a huge acceleration in the number of targets that we're starting to see. So probably around half a dozen to a dozen targets being hit every single day around the world by some of these operators. It really spans both the globe geographically, but also pretty much every industry. Obviously, we've seen energy, we've seen software companies, we've seen hospitals, unfortunately, throughout the course of the pandemic that have been hit, including at least 4 hospital systems just in the last month that had to turn away patients during what is an unbelievably challenging time, of course, for these medical professionals. We've seen agriculture, a great article in the Record yesterday talking about the farms that were hit earlier this year by some of these attacks. One of them had to pay $9 million in ransom. So no one is immune. The ransom payments are going up because one of the other innovations that these criminals have started to adopt is the double extortion scheme, where in addition to locking up your data and demanding a ransom to unlock it, they will also threaten to release the data unless you pay up in a timely fashion, which really accelerates the decision process within most victim companies. If your data gets encrypted, you may decide, you know what, I'm going to give it 3-4 days for the IT team to see if they can restore the data from backup, if they can get us back up and running. But if, on the other hand, on top of that, you're getting the threat that if you don't pay within 48 hours, we'll release your data publicly. As a CEO, you may feel additional pressure to pay rather than wait for the recovery. And that's been very, very successful in those types of attacks. So let me stop there. That's just a brief overview of what we're seeing right now and why the situation has gotten so bad.
Dmitri, it really seems like in this case, I mean, technology is the problem, but is it also the solution? And what I mean by that is, I mean, you mentioned 300 million payments were made last year, according to Chainalysis. Like, this clearly is not getting any better. So are we thinking about this the wrong way? Is the idea of, the best defense being the best preparation, when we already say that it's just a matter of when, not if, you're going to get hit? Like, do we just need kind of a wholesale different way of approaching this?
I believe we do. And let me just say that there's no silver bullet here. Anyone that tells you if we only do this one thing is not being completely transparent or is not fully appreciating the scale of this problem. We need to look at both the technical solutions, we need to look at the geopolitical solutions, we need to look at cryptocurrency and what we can do from a regulatory perspective there. We also need to go on offense. So let me deal with those one by one. So I've co-written 2 op-eds in the Washington Post in the last few months with my colleague Matthew Rozhansky from the Wilson Center, one of the top Russia experts in the country. One was right before the Geneva summit, where we provided some thoughts about what the administration should do walking into the summit with Vladimir Putin in Geneva. That happened on June 16th. And then we wrote the follow-up post the Kaseya attacks. And the gist of both of the op-eds were that Vladimir Putin is the one person who has unique capability to not stop every ransom attack that's taking place, because not all of them, unfortunately, are originating from Russia, but a huge amount of them are being coordinated, directed by these kingpins that are based in Russia. And while there's no evidence that those individuals are operating at the direction of the Russian intelligence services or are being tasked by Russian intelligence services, the Russian intelligence services absolutely know who these people are. For one, they're absolutely very concerned about use of cryptocurrency. They're tracking cryptocurrency transactions that are taking place within Russia. So anytime these individuals would want to go into a cryptocurrency exchange and transfer money from Bitcoin into fiat currency, be it dollars, euros, or even rubles, the security services in Russia are well aware of that taking place and are able to determine how those funds are being acquired, shall we say. So they absolutely have the capacity to have visibility into those people. They absolutely have the capacity to arrest them and prosecute them if they wish so. Even if they don't wish to go that far, just showing up on their doorstep and telling them, we want you to knock it off or else, in Russian would have unique deterrent effects on those individuals. And one of the things that we've argued in the op-ed is that not only is it fairly easy for Vladimir Putin to order his security services to do that, because we're not dealing with that many people. At the very top, there's, I estimate, less than 200 people that are responsible for the vast majority of the ransom operations that we're seeing, probably well less than 100. So, but the other point is that those people are not connected to the regime. They're not oligarchs in Russia. They're not part of Vladimir Putin's entourage. So there's virtually no cost for him to lean in on those people and get them to back off from a political perspective. So you have a unique confluence of events where, one, it's easy to do, it's fairly cheap to do. And if we can convince them, if President Biden can convince them that should he not take that step, there will be severe repercussions. And Matthew and I have argued that those repercussions should include severe sanctions on the Russian oil and gas sector, which so far has been immune to most of the sanction activity that we have taken place, in part because this would be a very drastic step. Our European partners who are getting most of the gas from the Russian pipelines would not be happy with us at all. But if we believe that ransomware has become such an epidemic where we can't tolerate our hospitals being attacked, our pipelines being shut down, our meat processors, the GPS meat processor, one of the largest in the world, was shut down back in June. If we believe that we can no longer tolerate that, then I believe we should be willing to take that step to threaten the use of sanctions, not necessarily to execute them, but to threaten the use of sanctions should Vladimir Putin not crack down. Obviously, if he doesn't, we would have to follow through. Otherwise, we would look like a paper tiger. So if we make the threat, we should be willing to execute on it. But hopefully it won't come to that. And if we can convince him that we are deadly serious, and it's easy for him to accommodate us on this particular issue in a way that would not be easy for him to do, or he would have zero interest in doing on so many other issues that we have problems with in Russia, I think we can solve a huge chunk of the problem. Won't eliminate everything, because we have Iranian actors that are conducting ransomware attacks. We have North Koreans, the state itself, doing ransomware operations, and in some cases, even Chinese contractors working for the Ministry of State Security have done them. So it doesn't solve everything, but it can solve a huge chunk of it. At the same time, we need to make it much more difficult for these operators to get the payments. I believe that we need to crack down on global exchanges, cryptocurrency exchanges that allow people to convert cryptocurrency into fiat currency, which almost everyone wants to do, because if you want to go buy a yacht, if you want to go buy a Ferrari, at least right now, it's difficult to do that with cryptocurrency. You need to convert it into dollars, you need to convert it into euros, and most of these individuals are doing that. So we have a unique opportunity to say, if anyone is doing a conversion of, let's say, over $10,000 in a particular year, you have to request a passport. You have to provide that information to law enforcement should it be requested, so we can start identifying those people. And exchanges that do not cooperate with US requests should be sanctioned and cut off from the global financial system, which would make it impossible for them to operate. So we can do a lot to actually create a lot of transparency within the cryptocurrency ecosystem. Third, we need to fully leverage our intelligence community, our cyber command capabilities to go on offense against these individuals. If you look at what we were able to do against ISIS back in 2015, not just with kinetic operations on the ground, but also with cyber command engaging in very aggressive operations in support of that to disrupt, degrade, including disinformation campaigns against individuals involved. Imagine if we turn that capability on these ransomware crews to try to sow discord, to try to get them to doubt each other, to try to steal their money and return it back to the victims, as we were able to do in at least one situation. So there's a lot of things that we can be doing to make it much more difficult for them to operate. It won't necessarily have a deterrent effect as much as a law enforcement action would, but it can make it much more difficult and less scalable for them to continue perpetrating these attacks. And then the last one is the one you mentioned, which is we need to invest in defense. Every company needs to assume that they can be targets of these attacks because for the most part, the targets are opportunistic. If you've got an affiliate of our Evo that buys access from a botnet operator into a bunch of Fortune 500 companies, they didn't necessarily look at who those companies are. They didn't look for their vulnerabilities. They just went to someone who managed to infect them by sending probably a lot of phishing emails, cast a wide net, got some fish to bite, and now you've got a problem because there's a beachhead that affiliate can expose to get to the broader network and ultimately encrypt all the data. But however, at the national level, I don't believe we're going to defend ourselves out of this problem, because the Kaseya attack illustrates this very, very well. Most of the victims of the Kaseya attack were not the major Fortune 500 companies. They were small and medium businesses. They were dental offices. There were school districts. They were fire departments. The types of organizations that are actually least prepared to deal with the problem, don't have the resources, don't have the personnel, and there are too many of them in this country for us to be able to defend them all. It's just not going to happen. So at the national level, our policy needs to be on what can we do to deter these actors, to make it difficult for them to operate, to lean in on regimes that are providing them safe haven and allowing them to continue to execute these attacks.
I think you're more optimistic than I am on the whole geopolitical and sanctions component of it, Dmitri, because I don't have a lot of faith that you have a Russian leader who isn't, his own government isn't profiting from these criminal organizations conducting these things, but also it's sort of, underlying supporting his other objectives. However, I love that being one of the options. When you talk about the intelligence community and going on the offensive, I'm sitting down next week with the National Cybersecurity Director, Chris Inglis, who you know, and talking about a range of issues about what his office is now being charged to do. But the NSA, Cyber Command have been engaging in offensive, what they say are offensive activities for a while now. I mean, it started sort of ramping up their offensive capabilities, I think, under the Trump administration. Do you think they're not doing enough, or are you just really focused on the fact that that has to be a critical component to an overall way to address this issue?
Yeah. Well, great get on Chris, one of the leading minds on cyber for so many years, both inside and outside government. He was actually one of our strategic council members at Silverado before he went into this new position that was created by Congress. To answer your question, so yes, a lot of the gloves have come off on cyber offensive capabilities, and I think rightly so, because we were unnecessarily restricting ourselves in this battle space for concerns that really never made much sense to me. Concerns around blowback that just never materialized. We have incredible, talented professionals working both at Cyber Command and NSA and other intelligence agencies that can execute very, very precise attacks in cyberspace that won't cause any collateral damage. In fact, our adversaries have been doing those types of attacks for 30 years. So you're not going to convince me that if Russia, China, Iran, North Korea can do them, why the US intelligence community with much bigger budgets, much greater talents in this particular space cannot. So that's a good thing. The issue is that those attacks have traditionally been directed against foreign intelligence services, foreign militaries, not criminals. And the intelligence community has been very hesitant until recently to actually engage in what it believes is a law enforcement issue. Criminal actors, not state sponsored or state supported actors. I think Colonial started to change that. When you started to see the impact on national security from these attacks and the limitations of law enforcement in this particular situation, because most of the criminals are outside of our jurisdiction and are very difficult to arrest, although not impossible, as we saw just this week. Ironically, one of the members of TrickBot, a criminal group that was deploying ransomware, he was a Russian citizen that traveled to South Korea about a year and a half ago and got stuck in South Korea because of COVID. South Korea shut down its borders. And by the time he was ready to leave, the FBI caught up with him, realized who he was, and the South Koreans just arrested him this week. So we've been able to get a number of those types of successes when people travel outside of Russia. But of course, as a result, many people are realizing that that's a difficult thing to do and a dangerous thing to do, I should say. And they're better off going to Crimea than a vacation in Thailand. So, but nevertheless, I think you're starting to see some changes where the intelligence community is appreciating that they need to get into this fight and help support law enforcement. And I think we should be doing a lot more of that. If we bring our capabilities to bear, there's a lot we can do. It's not a panacea, it's not going to stop everything, but we can make life very, very difficult for these people, and we should be doing everything in our power to do so.
Yeah, I think that's the frustrating part for those of us who are not cyber experts in the way that you are, is just the basic premise that we have capabilities that we're not using, I think is frustrating given the growth of this and the impact that it will have on national security. So let's get technical for just a minute. Patrick Gall is the executive director of the National Technology Security Coalition, which is sponsoring a great conference themselves in DC later this month. Patrick says that he's heard some cyber experts say that ensuring your critical computers are backed up in air-gapped locations with multiple versions of the backups is the safest strategy to protect against ransomware, or at least the best way to ensure that you can recover. And I'm thinking about those smaller and mid-sized companies, Dmitri, that you talked about. But Patrick asks, weren't the Iranian centrifuges and the Stuxnet attack air-gapped? And he says, how effective is air gapping overall? Now, you might not be able to compare the Stuxnet situation to a mid-sized company. However, I mean, I completely see Patrick's question, and are they safe or are they not safe?
Well, air gap is such a misnomer these days. It really does not exist in anywhere but the most sensitive classified systems. Even classified networks have so-called guards that allow them to pass information between the low side and the high side these days, because having a completely disconnected network is such a huge impediment to work. Is so difficult to do. And I've almost never seen working air gaps in industry except in the nuclear sector, where it is mandated by regulations. And even there, unfortunately, we've seen a lot of exceptions where people connect networks that should never be connected. So it is almost impossible to execute an air gap, a true air gap in a modern network. I don't see that being as part of the solution. And by the way, think about the backups that this person just raised. How are you going to back up continuously to an air gap network that is disconnected? You can't, right? It would have to be a manual process. You probably can't do it every day. Probably can't even do it every week. And as a result, your backups will be outdated, and the more outdated they become, the more worthless they become. But one of the other issue with the backup strategy, and by the way, I'm all in favor of backups. I think everyone should be practicing backups. Of course, when they're not disconnected, as is the case in almost every situation, the first thing that the ransomware operators try to do is destroy those backups so you can't recover. But even when the backups are there, I've seen so many cases where the CEOs decide to pay ransom anyway. And it used to shock me. I was like, why would you pay $5-10 million when you can just spend the time to restore from backups? And the answers range from it would take too long. If my factory is down for an hour, I'm losing $2 million. And if it takes me 2 days to restore, it's cheaper for me to pay $5 million in ransom. So it's a very hardcore calculation of payment versus restore and the ROI of each. But the other more prevalent reason that I've seen when doing these incident responses is that in the initial sort of hours of the fallout from the ransomware attack, when you are having a briefing with a CEO, you're still in a fog of war. You're still trying to figure out what has happened, who attacked us, what did they do, how big is the impact. You can't answer the question which is asked by the CEO of how quickly can you restore. The best you can do is give me a day, I'll come back and tell you we're putting all of our resources on it. And that answer is often unsatisfactory to the CEO, especially when you have the double extortion scheme of we're going to release your data in 48 hours if you don't pay. So often they choose to pay not because they don't have an option, but because they don't know if they have an option, because they can't get an answer quickly enough of what is restorable and how quickly you can restore. And that is what's driving a lot of these ransom payments. So people need to be realistic about what happens when a ransomware attack occurs. I highly recommend for people to work with their incident response providers or with their law firms to do tabletop exercises for senior executives, not just for your IT people, not just for your security people, but for CEOs and their executive staff to run through a realistic scenario of what a ransomware attack looks like so that they are prepared and they can make better decisions should the unfortunate situation occur and they get hit by ransomware.
And we've done a few of those tabletop exercises with you, Dmitri, both down at the threat conference that we're doing again in October, and then we did one virtually for the summit that we had for the Cyber Initiatives Group this year. I can't tell you how eye-opening going through those sessions is for people. So I completely back you up on that. Let's get back to something that Tom Stockmeyer talked about just off the top, and that was the vendor reporting. When there's a breach in their systems and they're part of the national security supply chain after the fact. I mean, it is a little bit too late to really be able to stop any of the, massive hemorrhaging at that point. How are you thinking about, vendors and their own security when they are smaller companies? They don't have the resources of the larger company they're working for in many cases. How are you thinking about that, and how are you advising people to deal with that situation?
Tom is absolutely right. It's a huge issue, both at the individual level of how do you deal with your own supply chains and a national level. The fact of the matter is that the U.S. government knows only about a fraction of the ransomware attacks and fraction of the intrusions that the private sector is experiencing because the reporting is very limited unless PII, personally identifiable information, is shown to be stolen or shown to be accessed by an adversary. There's almost no requirements for reporting outside of a few regulated industries. And even when you have a situation with potential impact to PII, you have a lot of very creative lawyers that are typically running these investigations saying, well, do we really know? And if we don't know, we may not need to report. And by the way, if we don't find out, wink, wink, we totally don't need to report. So how the investigation proceeds is often driven by reporting obligations and some of those regulatory requirements. That's why I'm a huge believer that we need to reform, we need a breach notification law at the national level, which we don't even have. We have some great proposals coming out of the Senate and the House right now on a bipartisan basis to require companies to report, and moving away from that model of that we've had in both GDPR and at the state level to focus on PII, which is, I think, superbly unhelpful, to actually start focusing on the impact of these attacks, and also to start getting companies to provide technical details of how those attacks were conducted so that the government would have a full picture of what's going on. At the individual supply level perspective, you need to sort of enforce this through contractual obligations. So dealing with vendors, you need to make it clear cut that if there's an impact to your data in any way, if there's a suspected impact to your data, they better come to you and disclose it. So you really want to review those contracts and make sure that they're airtight and there are real damages attached to failures to report.
Yeah, that would be the disincentive. Patrick McLeod has an interesting question. He says Congress is considering legislation to direct DHS to study the pros and cons of hackback, which we talked about for years, and the hackback authorities for the private sector. Should this be taken seriously, do you think, in addressing ransomware? And what authorities would these companies need to make a difference? Now, we've talked in the past pretty extensively I remember years ago talking to General Hayden about this issue. And a lot of companies are already setting up offshore. They're already kind of doing what they do. But what do you think about sort of formalizing some sort of authorities? And I mean, I'm terrified because it feels like the Wild West and you don't always know what you're doing out there.
Yeah, I've been watching, participating in this debate about hackback going back 10 plus years, and it seems to be going in circles and gets resurrected every few years, but never really goes anywhere. So I don't think any of those proposals are particularly serious. I think you have to start with a question of what do you want to accomplish with these hackback authorities, and most people aren't able to answer that. It shouldn't be about vigilantism. Obviously, we don't encourage that or allow that in our code. The case of getting your data back, I think, is a very squishy case where once in a blue moon maybe you'll ever have that opportunity. If you have authority to go into a command and control server run by a bad guy and get your data back, almost never happens that you can actually move that quickly. So I don't think that's a realistic scenario. Where I do think some authorities would be helpful is on the intelligence collection front. You have the private sector now that is one of the prime collectors of cyber intelligence, in many cases better than what the intelligence community is doing on some of these actors, giving them a few specialized companies and researchers some greater authorities to look overseas, not damage anything, not attack, but collect, would be I think potentially beneficial. It reminds me of a conversation I actually had with Chris Inglis a number of years ago, where Chris was at the time sort of looking at the hackback issue as well from a policy perspective, and said, Dmitri, would you want to have authorities to hack back? And I said, well, Chris, I actually wouldn't want to have authorities to hack back. I would want the authorities to hack. And sort of was taken aback by that, and he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, what I would love to have as a private sector organization, even though I realize that there are real issues with that and probably not a good idea, is to have authorities to go into adversary networks, foreign intelligence networks, criminal networks, and monitor what they're doing. So I would have advanced warning of when they're launching attacks. I would love to be a SIGINT agency. And he said, whoa, wait a second. That is clearly the responsibility of the government. I said, yes, it is, and it should be. I'm not asking for the authorities to be clear, but if you are thinking about what a private sector could do, that's an area where I think you can explore something that might be helpful, maybe on a more limited basis, where anything you learn you have to provide to the government. But the whole hackback nonsense, like we're going to go and damage and get into a fight with the Russian FSB or some of these criminal groups, that's not going to lead us to anything good.
Yeah, the privatizing intelligence collection on cyber threats. I like that. That's such a great topic. A lot of folks in the Cipher Brief network have commented recently about the need for the U.S. to change the way it engages in the gray zone, something that you've also talked about. What needs to change? And is there anything we can learn from our major adversaries that you would adopt for U.S. tactics?
Well, as I mentioned, our adversaries are pretty unconstrained in their operations. They don't have to run them by a million lawyers before they get approved. They're very nimble. They're very creative. Much more creative than we are, frankly, when we're launching our own operations. So that's an area that I think we can still improve upon, where we need to appreciate that the nuclear analogy really does not belong in the cyber discussion. Cyber weapons are not nuclear weapons. They're not even kinetic weapons. It is very, very difficult to kill someone through cyber attack and only through secondary or third order effects. So let's be clear about the limitations of those weapons, and also the benefits that they can provide if used appropriately. So the idea that we should be so constrained in their operations never made any sense to me. I had a very senior person in Cyber Command during the 2015 engagements with ISIS tell me that it literally is easier for DoD to execute a kinetic strike from an unmanned aerial vehicle against a suspected terrorist than it is for them to hack their computer. How does that make any sense, right?
That's
In terms of the authorities and approvals that they have to get to execute that cyber operation versus a kinetic strike against that individual. So that makes zero sense, and those constraints should be loosened up. I'm all for oversight. I'm all for making sure that we're doing the right things, but putting so many handcuffs on our intelligence community in this particular area doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. It doesn't make any sense at all. Srinivasi Valamali would like to ask, isn't the supply chain, are supply chain risks related to an implicit trust model? And how can zero trust address these risks? How do you feel about zero trust?
So look, I love zero trust. The concept is actually very, very old, going back to the 70s, something called an Orange Book. Some of the gray hairs may remember that. Came out of DoD initial thinking about how to do this thing called, at the time, information security, that's now evolved into cybersecurity, segmentation, least privilege. All those concepts are super old, 50, 60 years old now. Zero trust is a great framework to put it all together. I think the best articulation of it and sort of the modern origins of it came from Google, where in 2010, some of you may remember, Google was hacked by China, famously came forward and admitted it, even though they didn't have to. Talked about attribution as well, which was unprecedented at the time. But then they spent the next 7 years working to re-architect their systems, looking at lessons learned and thinking about how do we make sure that this doesn't happen to us again. And out of that came what they initially called Beyond Corp, the idea that you're not going to defend a massive network like Google's with 100,000 employees against external threat actors or frankly internal threat actors. You have to assume that the threat actors are already on the inside, and the only way to defend that is make sure that every single asset in your network is a castle on its own, that every laptop, every server, every router, you are defending on its own, and then you have no implicit trust between those assets, so that if you're trying to log in from your laptop into some service somewhere, you have strong authentication with hardware two-factor authentication on those connections. So they rebuilt all that, and they came to the logical conclusion that, which is a radical conclusion, that they should get rid of VPNs, which sounds counterintuitive, but because for the longest time, people thought of VPN as a security tool sort of around helping to build a perimeter around your network and then allowing sort of authenticate connections in. And they turned that thinking on its head and said, no, VPNs are that castle moat mentality where we think that no one can get in, and the reality is the actors are already in. So if we get rid of VPN and we treat every asset as if it's on the open internet, because it would be, and start thinking about defending it individually, having the right visibility into that asset, having the right authentication principles, that's how we make it super, super difficult. Because right now, most networks are Swiss cheese. And the reason why these ransomware attacks work, the reason why these nation state intrusions work is because all the actor has to do is find one way in, one person to make a mistake, click on something they shouldn't have, reuse a password, what have you. But once they're in, it's super simple. They dump credentials, they move around, they own the entire network in minutes, oftentimes. And if you make that impossible, yes, they can get on one machine, but then they can go anywhere else, and every single follow-on movement is a new intrusion. That raises the bar astronomically for them and dramatically limits their ability to do serious damage to an organization. So I'm a huge believer in the concept. Now there'll be a lot of vendors that'll tell you that if you just buy this one widget, you'll be magically zero trust compliant. That's nonsense. Zero trust is a philosophy, not a tool. Tools can help you implement that philosophy, but you need to be thinking first and foremost of how do I break down all the trusts in my networks and make sure that I'm defending each and every asset as its own sort of isolated castle system, and all the authentication connections do not assume any trust, that there's strong authentication, preferably hardware built on each one of those connections.
I love that. Zero trust is a philosophy, not a tool. One more question here, and then I'm going to come to you for some closing comments, Dmitri. This question is from Stefan Simons. He's with Deutsche Welle, which of course is the German version of the BBC. He says, what would it take to establish an industry-wide norm, an industrial norm or standard that guarantees that all companies have a federally defined level of minimum cybersecurity? He says, is it possible, beneficial, or useful?
I don't believe it's either of those things. I am not a believer that you can do security through a checklist. I don't even believe that companies should be told, here are the 3 things you should be doing, 2-factor, updates, etc., because it depends on the company. The people that are often advocating those blanket solutions have never run real networks, don't appreciate the realities of real networks. If I go into industrial control system network and tell them that they need to update their software anytime a patch is released, they'll laugh me out of the room, because doing that will absolutely 100% take down their production system every month. It will cause more damage than any cyber attack would ever would. So you have to appreciate some of those realities that the companies are engaged in. If you tell people to do 2-factor, sure, in the abstract sense, 2-factor is fantastic. But if you're telling a company to do 2-factor, chances are they're not doing something else. And you probably don't know if that something else was more important or less important than your 2-factor recommendation, because you don't understand their threat model, you don't understand their capabilities, you don't understand how they're trying to protect and what they're trying to protect. So those blanket recommendations I don't think are ever helpful. I do think that there is a role for government regulations in the space, but not a prescriptive regulation, which will always be behind new technology advances, the threat model. Just the government can never move fast. But they can hold companies accountable. Once there is a failure, you can go back and look, was that company doing the right things? And what is the level of negligence that might have been there that caused that attack? And that's how I think you raise the bar, by making sure that the highest levels of the company, the CEO, the board of directors, are looking at the right metrics and are responding to challenges either at the metric level or in real incidents. I've long been a proponent of speed-based metrics. I think the key to winning a cyber battle is to be faster than the adversary, faster at detecting incidents, faster at investigating incidents, faster at responding to incidents. And I think if you force companies to track those metrics internally, to report them to the boards of directors, and then if there's an incident, you can go back and subpoena those metrics and look at what the boards and the CEO were doing in response to it. If the metrics show that quarter after quarter, it was taking longer to find attackers, longer to remediate networks, was the board responding to that? Were they giving more authorities, more resources to the security team? Were they replacing the leadership of that security team? Or did they just let it fly and the problem got worse and worse? And in that case, there should be real liability on that company and that board of directors. I think that's the way that we raise the bar and get our security to a better state.
Speed test. Yeah, I like that a lot. Dmitri, okay, looking forward at a future, we've talked about some really interesting things today, including like how the national security supply chain is being impacted by the cyber threat and by ransomware in particular. I really loved when you talked about sort of the criminal the criminal activity groups, really, and thinking about them differently more, and how what they're doing is impacting national security as well. As you think about how this threat might look with criminal groups and cryptocurrencies and authorities that the US government does or doesn't have, which may be limiting its ability, like, what kind of a future should we expect, 5-6 years down the road? Like, what kind of industry? It feels like there's enormous growth on the criminal cybersecurity side. What's it going to look like in a few years?
Well,
it's a dark movie, isn't it?
Yeah, the safest predictions you can make in this field, unfortunately, is that the problem will be getting worse. And those predictions have been made over the last 20 years, and they've been proven correct each and every year. Until there is real consequences for nation states or criminal groups or hacktivist groups that we're increasingly starting to see in the space as well, you're never going to get ahead of the threat. You need to bring real accountability to these people. You need to start putting them in jail, start creating consequences for them. It's just like traditional real world crime. Imagine if there were no arrests ever for burglaries, for murders, Do you think the problem would get any better? I doubt it. So it's no different in cyberspace.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great. Dmitri, I'm really looking forward to welcoming you next month and really looking forward to running through the exercise that we do every year. It's great to have you there, to have you engaging in all of these conversations, which you contribute so much knowledge and perspective to each of them. And then, of course, running this fabulous exercise.
Thank you. And Suzanne, if you let me plug one thing, there's an event that Silverado will be doing on September 23rd, a virtual event where I'll be moderating a panel with top 3 Russia experts, my very good friend Matthew Rozhansky, as well as 2 other experts. And we'll be talking about the evaluation of the Biden administration's Russia strategy post-Geneva, what we've achieved, we haven't achieved, as well as touching obviously on the ransomware issue as well. It'll be a fascinating discussion. Go to silverado.org if you want to register for that event. 1 o'clock Eastern, September 23rd. It will actually be 4 days after the Russian elections in their Duma, their parliament. So fascinating discussion, and we'll look forward to questions from the audience as well.
Dmitri, thanks. We have a calendar section in our morning newsletter, of course, which has an open source report every day. I'm going to throw that in the calendar session for everybody as well. So we'll put a link in there for folks too. All right. Well, thank you, my friend. It's been a pleasure. I wish I could say we have conversations that are more uplifting, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I think it's good to have really sensible ideas brought to the table, and I really appreciate your perspective on this. So thanks so much for joining. There are a few remaining seats for that throughout conference. Again, if you're interested, tcbconference.com. I want to thank you all for your time. A lot of what we do here, you know, some of you send me feedback afterwards. It means a lot. We are bringing a lot of this into that cyber initiatives group conversation that we have, which is a really wide-ranging group of experts. Check it out at cyberinitiativegroup.com. And then we hope you'll sign up and join us. It's free. You can't beat that deal. Thank you so much. Take care. Thank you to Cyware. We will see you here next time.